Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution is arguably the most powerful section of the Constitution. This is where you find the enumerated powers of Congress, and that is pretty much a list of the powers, obligations, and duties that Congress has in government. An enumerated power, these are the powers of federal government that are specifically described in the Constitution. I mean, seriously, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, and you all should, and read it, it says very specifically what Congress can do, what they have to do, what is their duty to do. The Founding Fathers' idea was that any power not specifically given to the government, given to Congress, would lie within the people. The people would have all the rights and all the powers except for these that were put in the Constitution. But along with enumerated powers, there are also implied powers. So an enumerated power very specifically says what you can do. An implied power are powers that are not specifically listed in the Constitution, but seem to be implied by the enumerated powers. And we have examples of the enumerated powers and occasionally an implied power that goes with it. Congress has the power to levy taxes. Everything that the government provides for its citizens has to be paid for somehow. And the way that's done is that Congress charges and collects taxes to pay for those things that are deemed to be for the common good. Every service that you get from the government, the military, anything, national parks, anything you can think of that the government pays for comes from collecting money from the citizens. Now, an implied power that would go along with this is Congress creating the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, to help in the collection and processing of taxes. That came from the enumerated power of levying taxes. There's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress makes the IRS. It's just implied that they can do these things in order to do what they're supposed to do. Congress can borrow money because when the government spends more than it brings in taxes, which it does regularly, it has to borrow money to make up the difference. This is known as a deficit. Anytime on an annual budget that the government spends more money than it receives through taxes, that's a deficit. All the deficits added together, that's the national debt. Congress has the right and the power to regulate commerce. And this is the Commerce Clause. And Congress has used this and the courts have used this to expand the federal government's power in all kinds of areas. The Constitution says that government regulates commerce with foreign nations and among the states. But there are a lot of implied powers that go along with that. Just a couple. For instance, establishing the minimum wage was an implied power. Nowhere does it say in the Constitution that people will make a certain amount of money when they work, but Congress has decided that part of regulating commerce, regulating business, is to make sure that its citizens make at least a minimum wage. Something more related to grabbing power from the Commerce Clause is the regulation of products like alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. That's an implied power from the Commerce Clause. They get to regulate commerce, so they get to regulate those items and many, many other items as well. Congress is in charge of naturalization and bankruptcy, and I've always thought that this was an interesting two things to put together. Naturalization is the process in which a foreign citizen becomes a U.S. citizen, and bankruptcy is when a person or organization can no longer pay their debts. It's a protection so that there's no debtor's jail in the United States, and this is a protection for individuals and government, and organizations to be protected. I think why they put them together is because they wanted it to have one set of rules for everyone. So when it comes to the naturalization process, it's one set of rules on how to become a citizen. It doesn't matter who you are, how old you are, where you're from, you have to go through these steps to get there. And I think it's the same thing in bankruptcy. They wanted one system in place so that no matter who you are or what business you are, it's kind of a unified system to make sure that everyone is the same, is treated the same and equally. Congress has the right and the power to coin money, to create money. See, this is one of the problems that the United States had under the Articles of Confederation. Every state had its own different money. Can you imagine having to do exchange rates for crossing state lines? I mean, I can't even fathom what that would be like. Just driving across the country, you'd have to use 10 different kinds of money every state line you cross. That would be impossible. Because of the enumerated powers to coin money, the United States only has one type of money. Congress has the right to create post offices and postal roads. You get your mail. It's important to the Founding Fathers that we did. An implied power, some implied powers that come from this, the prohibition of mail fraud, and the creation of the interstate system. Imagine that. The Constitution says that you can have, it's Congress's power to create post offices and postal roads, and from that, the government decided it has the power and the right to make interstate system, which is one of the greatest systems of travel around the world. Congress is in control of patents and copyrights. The Constitution says that Congress, in an effort to promote science and the arts, has the power to protect authors and inventors in their endeavors. And that means if you're an inventor and you come up with something and you file a patent, that protects your idea, that it protects the thing that you built from being copied and from profit being made from somebody else. It's the same way with authors and artists. If you write a book, you can get a copyright, and that protects you from your work being copied by someone else and sold by someone else's profit. Congress has the power to create courts that are under the Supreme Court, federal courts that are under the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States is a separate and equal power in the federal government. They are the final say in all laws. But Congress has the power and duty to establish federal courts that are inferior to that are under the Supreme Court. There are federal district courts across the country. Congress created each of those. And if they needed to and felt that it was required, they could disband one or more of those or create more. It's up to Congress. They're in charge of figuring out the lower courts. A very large power that only Congress has the right to do is to declare war. And I often ask in class how many people there are that think we have declared war recently. I ask, when's the last time we declared war? And I will inevitably get an answer, Vietnam or Korea or Iraq or Afghanistan. But the truth of the matter is that the United States, the last time the United States officially declared war was in 1942. And it was against small countries like Bulgaria and Romania that were allied with Nazi Germany. That was the last time that the United States officially declared war, even though we've been in armed conflict around the world pretty much since, someplace or another. And Congress has the power to raise and support an army and provide and maintain a navy. They are, not only do they have the power to do that, but they have the responsibility to do that, to protect the new country, to protect the country at all times. That's a enumerated power. Now, an implied power that would come from that, the Air Force was created from an implied power to create an army. The Founding Fathers had no concept that we might someday need an Air Force or a Space Force for that matter. So the implied power, when the time came, Congress created an Air Force. It doesn't say in the Constitution you can create an Air Force, but it's implied because it does say that Congress can create an army. And Congress has had the implied power to create a draft from the power to raise and support an army. Congress is also in charge of governing the District of Columbia. The Constitution states that Congress is responsible for running Washington, D.C. The original idea was that it would be a place central, the capital of the United States would be a place central to simply create laws and to govern, and that it really wouldn't be a major, populated area, but it turns out that it is. Congress over time has allowed Washington, D.C. to be governed as a local municipality with a governor, not with a governor, but with a mayor and city councils. They have their own schools. And at the very end of Article 1, Section 8 is the necessary and proper clause. And this pretty much gives Congress all kinds of power. And this is what it says in the Constitution. Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution and foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. And what that means is Congress has the power to create any law necessary and proper to do all the things that are listed above it in Article 1, Section 8. We can pass the laws we need to pass in order to do the jobs that we're supposed to do.